Tonight, we step softly into a story that is both immense and intimate. It is the story of a land that has carried civilizations for thousands of years, and of a people whose spirit could not be broken. No matter how heavy the weight placed upon them, it is the long, winding journey of India's independence. Before you settle in, take a second to make sure you're cozy. If you enjoy these kinds of late-night history wanderings, consider subscribing. And if you'd like, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always interesting to see who's listening along from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put on a small fan just for that steady hum in the background. And let's slowly drift into tonight's story together. India's independence is remembered as a moment, a single date on the calendar, the 15th of August, 1947. But the truth is far larger. Independence was not a sudden event, but the outcome of centuries of change, centuries of struggle, of resilience, of quiet acts of courage by countless men and women whose names most of us will never know. It was not given. It was earned, piece by piece, over generations. When we imagine India in the time before independence, we must look back far beyond the 20th century. For thousands of years, the land that we call India, stretching from the Himalayas in the north to the seas in the south, from the deserts of Rajasthan to the lush forests of the east, had been home to a mosaic of kingdoms, empires, languages, and faiths. Rarely was it ever a single political unit, yet always it carried a sense of shared civilization. By the 18th century, the Mughal Empire, once the dominant power in much of the subcontinent, was weakening. Regional kingdoms rose and fell, and into this changing world came outsiders. Traders at first, who sailed in on ships with white sails, carrying goods and ambitions. Among them were the merchants of the British East India Company. At first, they sought only trade, but trade led to influence, influence led to power, and soon power became rule. The story of India's independence is therefore not only about the final years of British withdrawal, but about the entire arc of this transformation, from traders to conquerors, from rulers to retreat. It is about how ordinary farmers, workers, teachers, and students lived through these changes, and how slowly the idea of freedom began to take root. This is the story of the millions of lives intertwined with history. As we move, we will meet the figures who shaped this journey. Some names you know well: Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, Subhas Chandra Bose. Others may be less familiar: farmers who refused to grow indigo, women who led salt marches, poets and writers who stirred the imagination of a nation. Each of them added their own small flame, and together those flames became a fire too strong to be extinguished. It is also important to remember that independence was not without its sorrows. The final step, when freedom was won, also brought partition, the painful division of India and Pakistan, the uprooting of millions of people, and violence that scarred the subcontinent. Freedom and loss arrived together, hand in hand. That complexity is part of the story, too. We will begin at the beginning, with the first steps of colonial rule, with the rise of the East India Company, and with the earliest stirrings of resistance. To understand the struggle for freedom, we must first understand how foreign rule took hold in the first place. And so, we drift back in time to the days when ships first appeared on India's shores, carrying men who came not to conquer but to trade. It was the 17th century, And India was not one nation as we think of it today. Instead, it was a vast expanse of kingdoms and regions, each with its own rulers, languages, and traditions. In the north, the Mughal Empire still held sway, though its strength was slowly fraying. In the south and west, Maratha power was rising. Across the subcontinent, people lived by rhythms of farming, weaving, trading, and worshipping, rarely imagining that their world might soon be reshaped by distant strangers. The British East India Company arrived as one among many foreign traders. The Portuguese had already established settlements along the coast. The Dutch and the French were also building their footholds. To most Indians, these Europeans were little more than foreign merchants competing for spices, silks, and textiles. The company set up its first trading posts in places like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. At first, their role was limited. They purchased goods, shipped them across the seas, and sold them at great profit in Europe. But trade carries its own form of power. With each factory and fort they built, the company extended its influence. They struck deals with local rulers, offering military support in exchange for privileges. And slowly, the company ceased to be just a merchant body. It became a political actor. Its soldiers fought battles, its agents collected taxes, and its administrators began to govern territories. One turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. There, the East India Company, under Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj ud-Dowlah, with the help of betrayal from within the Nawab's court. The victory gave the company effective control of Bengal, one of India's richest provinces, and from Bengal its reach spread further and further. This shift was not merely political. It touched the lives of ordinary people in ways both subtle and stark. Farmers who once paid taxes to local rulers now found themselves answering to company collectors. These taxes were often higher and more rigidly enforced. The company was less concerned with the well-being of the people and more concerned with the profit to be made for shareholders back in London. One of the clearest examples of this was the indigo system. Indigo dye was in high demand in Europe, and Bengal's soil was perfect for growing it. The company and its agents forced peasants to plant indigo instead of food crops. The peasants received little payment, and the land they relied on for their own sustenance was taken over by a crop they could not eat. This led to famine, hardship, and resentment. In 1770, Bengal suffered a devastating famine that killed millions. While the company's coffers remained full, the fields of Bengal lay empty, and its people starved. These conditions planted the earliest seeds of resistance. Farmers and workers began to revolt in small, scattered uprisings. These were not yet calls for independence, as we think of it today, but they were acts of defiance against unbearable exploitation. Each act of refusal, each small rebellion, was like a stone dropped into a pond, creating ripples that would one day grow into waves. Meanwhile, the company continued to expand. It did not conquer all of India at once, but piece by piece, using a mixture of military might and political maneuvering. When rulers resisted, battles were fought. When alliances could be made, treaties were signed. The Marathas, the Sikhs, the Mysore kingdom under Tipu Sultan, each fought their own struggles against the company. Some were defeated in battle, others were weakened by negotiation. Slowly, the map of India shifted as the company's territories spread like ink across a page. The company also sought to remake Indian society in ways that served its own interests. English education was introduced, at first, to create a class of interpreters and clerks who could assist in administration. Railways were built, not for the benefit of farmers or travelers, but to move goods and troops more efficiently. New laws were passed, reshaping customs and practices. For some Indians, these changes opened doors to new ideas and opportunities. For many more, they created feelings of alienation and loss. At the same time, the world of ideas was shifting. Across Europe and America, talk of liberty and rights was spreading. Indian intellectuals and reformers began to absorb these ideas. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated in cities, discussing not only politics, but also the question of justice and fairness under colonial rule. For the first time, the notion that India might not always remain under foreign power began to take shape. Yet, in these early years, resistance remained fragmented. There was no single freedom movement. Instead, there were many small struggles, peasant uprisings, tribal revolts, protests against land taxes, intellectual critiques of colonial rule. Each of these added a thread to the growing fabric of dissent. The company's rule continued until the mid-19th century, but its foundation was shaken in 1857, when the Great Revolt, also called the First War of Independence by many, erupted. This, however, we will save for later, for it marks a new chapter in India's story. For now, as we drift in these earlier years, we can see how the story of independence began not in speeches or parliaments, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people. A farmer forced to plant indigo instead of food. A weaver whose livelihood was destroyed when British textiles flooded the market. A soldier in the company's army caught between loyalty to his land and service to foreign masters. Each life carried its own quiet weight, and together they created the foundation for what was to come. When you think of the East India Company, it may help to picture it not as a faceless entity, but as a network of ships, forts, offices, and soldiers stretching across the land and seas. Its reach was vast, but its roots were shallow, always dependent on the cooperation or coercion of the people it sought to rule. And beneath the surface, the soil was already shifting. Resentment was growing. Dreams of freedom, though faint and fragile, had begun to stir. As we close this part of the story, imagine Bengal's fields at dusk. Farmers walk home, weary from labor they did not choose. Traders count their coins in company offices, while in villages, families wonder what tomorrow will bring. The silence of night covers the land, but under that silence lies a quiet, restless energy, a longing for something more, a longing that one day would grow into a call too powerful to ignore. As we continue our journey through India's path to independence, we arrive at one of the most dramatic turning points in its history, the year 1857. To many, this year is remembered as the First War of Independence. To the British, it was long referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny. Whatever the name, it marked the first great, widespread effort to break free from foreign control. To understand why it happened, we must first step into the lives of those who served in the British East India Company's army. These soldiers, known as sepoys, were Indians recruited in large numbers. They fought under British officers, wore British uniforms, and marched to British orders. For some, it offered steady pay in uncertain times. But service in this army also meant hardship, strict discipline, and deep cultural discomfort. Resentment had been building for years. Pay and conditions were not always fair. Indian soldiers noticed that their opportunities for promotion were limited. They were trusted with muskets, but not with leadership. And as the company extended its territories, the sepoys often found themselves fighting not against foreign enemies, but against their own countrymen, fellow Indians, resisting company rule. Then came the spark that lit the fire. In 1857, new cartridges for the Enfield rifle were introduced. These cartridges had to be bitten open before loading. A rumor spread that the paper was greased with a mixture of cow fat and pig fat. For Hindu soldiers, the cow was sacred. For Muslim soldiers, the pig was forbidden. To bite into such cartridges would be a grave insult to their faith. The British dismissed these concerns as superstition. But for the sepoys, this was not merely about cartridges. It was the final insult in a long chain of disrespect and exploitation. Religion and dignity had been wounded, and anger boiled over. The uprising began in Meerut in May 1857, when sepoys refused to use the cartridges. They were punished harshly, their comrades forced to witness their humiliation. But instead of cowing them into obedience, the punishment ignited open revolt. Soldiers rose up, killed their officers, and marched toward Delhi. Delhi was not chosen by chance. There, the aging Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, still lived in the crumbling Red Fort. He no longer held real power, but he carried the weight of centuries of Mughal rule. When the rebels reached Delhi, they declared him their leader. For the first time, the revolt carried the banner of restoring Indian rule under an Indian emperor. News of the uprising spread like wildfire. From Kanpur to Lucknow, from Jhansi to Bareilly, rebellions broke out. Some were led by sepoys, others by local rulers and civilians who saw a chance to strike back against the company. Among the most remembered is Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, the warrior queen who fought fiercely to defend her kingdom after the British tried to annex it under the doctrine of lapse. Mounted on horseback, sword in hand, she became a symbol of courage and resistance. In Kanpur, Nana Sahib, the adopted son of a deposed Maratha ruler, took up arms against the company. In Awadh, common people joined in, driven by anger at the harsh land revenue system. In villages and towns, peasants attacked company officials, moneylenders, and landlords associated with British authority. It was not a single, unified movement. Each region had its own leaders, its own grievances, and its own battles. Yet, for the first time, so many strands of resistance came together, creating a wave that shook the very foundation of British rule in India. The British response was swift and brutal. Reinforcements were called from Britain and from other parts of the empire. Battles were fought street by street, fort by fort. In Delhi, after months of fierce fighting, the British recaptured the city. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, was captured, put on trial, and exiled to Rangoon. His sons were executed. With his fall, the dream of a restored Mughal power faded. In Jhansi, Rani Lakshmi Bai fell in battle in 1858. Her bravery became legendary, remembered in poems and stories for generations. In Lucknow and Kanpur, the sieges ended in bloodshed. Thousands of rebels and civilians were killed. Villages suspected of supporting the revolt were burned. The British made it clear that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. By mid-1858, the revolt had been crushed. But though the immediate result was defeat, the uprising had lasting consequences. The East India Company discredited and weakened, was abolished. From then on, India came under direct rule of the British Crown. A new era began, the British Raj. The revolt also left deep marks on both sides. For the British, it created lasting fear and suspicion of their Indian subjects. They tightened their control, reorganized the army to prevent such uprisings, and adopted policies that deliberately sowed divisions between communities. The idea of divide and rule became a cornerstone of colonial strategy. For Indians, the revolt left a more complicated legacy. It was not yet a national struggle in the modern sense. Hindus and Muslims fought side by side in some places, but in others, divisions remained. Many regions and rulers stayed loyal to the British. Yet the memory of 1857 lived on as proof that resistance was possible, that foreign rule was not unshakable. Poets, writers, and folk singers carried the stories of heroes like Rani Lakshmibai and Nana Sahib, keeping alive the spirit of defiance. In later decades, when new leaders emerged, they would look back to 1857 for inspiration. The revolt was like the first great storm before a long monsoon, fierce, chaotic, and incomplete, but carrying with it the promise of change. If you close your eyes and imagine India in those months of 1857, you might see smoke rising from forts and villages. You might hear the clash of swords, the roar of cannon fire, and the cries of both victory and despair. And you might sense, beneath the violence and the tragedy, a powerful awakening. The realization that India could rise up, that foreign power was not invincible, and that the struggle for freedom, though still distant, had truly begun. As the dust settled, and as British power reasserted itself, life returned to a tense kind of normalcy. But nothing would ever be quite the same again. The soil of India had been watered with both blood and hope. A seed had been planted, and though it would take decades to grow, the memory of 1857 remained, like an ember waiting to flare into fire once more. The year was 1885. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the revolt of 1857, and India had settled into the long shadow of the British Raj. The East India Company was gone, replaced by the direct rule of the British Crown. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, and the Viceroy in Calcutta presided over an empire that seemed, at least on the surface, unshakable. Railways crisscrossed the land, carrying goods and soldiers faster than ever before. Telegraph wires stretched across cities and plains, binding the vast subcontinent more tightly to the machinery of British administration. But beneath this new order, the stirrings of change were quietly growing. India was not the same country it had been in 1857. Education had spread, especially in urban centers. English-language schools and universities had been established in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. A new generation of Indians, trained in law, administration, and the sciences, emerged. They were clerks, teachers, lawyers, and journalists, people who understood the British system, who often admired parts of it, but who also saw its injustices clearly. These were the men, and later, women, who would become the first leaders of India's political awakening. In the late 19th century, Indians began to form political associations in different provinces. Groups like the Bombay Presidency Association, the Madras Mahajan Sabha, and the Indian Association in Calcutta provided platforms for educated Indians to discuss reforms, petition the government, and express their concerns. At first, their demands were modest. They sought greater Indian representation in the legislative councils, more say in local administration, and fairer treatment in the civil services. Their tone was loyal, their petitions respectful. But even in these early steps, a crucial shift was taking place. Indians were beginning to organize, not just as individuals or small groups, but as part of a larger political community. It was in this atmosphere that the Indian National Congress was founded in December 1885. The man often credited with bringing the Congress into being was a retired British civil servant, Alan Octavian Hume. Concerned about growing discontent in India, he believed that a political forum where Indians could air their grievances peacefully would serve as a safety valve. By channeling their frustrations into petitions and debates, he hoped to prevent more violent uprisings. With his support, 72 delegates from across India gathered in Bombay in 1885. They included lawyers, journalists, landowners, and professionals. Among them were figures like Dadabhai Naoroji, Womish Chunder Banerjee, and Surendranath Banerjee, names that would later echo in the story of India's freedom struggle. The first president of the Congress was W.C. Banerjee. The sessions were modest, the resolutions polite. They asked for greater Indian participation in government, more opportunities in the civil service, and an end to policies that drained India's wealth. Yet even in their cautious tone, the formation of the Congress marked a turning point. For the first time, Indians from different regions and communities had come together under one umbrella to speak for the nation. The first 2 decades of the Congress were dominated by leaders, later known as the moderates. Men like Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and M.G. Renaud believed in working within the system. They respected British institutions and hoped that through dialogue and persuasion, India could gradually win greater rights. Their methods were petitions, speeches, and resolutions. Their language was polite, often full of appeals to British fairness and justice. They believed that exposing the economic realities of colonialism would awaken Britain's conscience. One of the most influential contributions during this period came from Dadabhai Naoroji, often called the Grand Old Man of India. In his famous drain theory, he argued that Britain was systematically draining India's wealth through unfair trade, taxation, and the transfer of resources overseas. While India remained poor and famines spread, Britain grew richer on its back. His writings gave Indians a powerful economic argument against colonialism, showing that poverty was not the fault of the people, but the consequence of exploitation. A nation begins to imagine itself as the Congress met year after year. A subtle but significant change was taking place. Indians were beginning to think of themselves as part of a larger whole. Until then, India had been a patchwork of regions, languages, and identities. But in the halls of Congress meetings, Bengalis debated with Maharashtrians, Tamils with Gujaratis, Punjabis with Parsis. For the first time, the idea of an Indian nation began to take shape. The Congress also provided a platform for debate about social reforms. Issues like child marriage, the status of women, and the caste system were discussed alongside political demands. Reformers like Gopal Krishna Gokhale sought to modernize Indian society, believing that political freedom would only come hand in hand with social progress. Yet, it is important to remember that these early years of Congress were limited in scope. Its members were mostly drawn from the educated urban elite. The peasants, workers, and millions of rural Indians had little connection to these gatherings. Still, the seeds were being planted. By the late 19th century, frustration was growing. Famines devastated large parts of India, while the colonial administration's response was often indifferent. Taxes remained heavy, and the promised reforms were slow to come. Younger leaders began to question whether polite petitions were enough. They felt the Congress needed a stronger, more assertive voice. This gave rise to the division between the moderates and the extremists. The extremists, men like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Lala Lajpat Rai, argued for Swaraj, or self rule. They believed Indians had to rely on their own strength, not British goodwill. Tilak, with his fiery speeches and his use of Hindu religious festivals as platforms for political mobilization, became particularly influential. His declaration, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it," inspired many and marked a shift in the tone of Indian politics. This tension between the old guard of moderates and the rising extremists would shape the Congress in the decades to come. But whether moderate or radical, the Congress had become the voice of political India, a forum that could not be ignored. If you imagine those first Congress sessions, you might picture a modest hall in Bombay or Calcutta, filled with men in traditional turbans and European suits. You might hear the scratch of pens writing resolutions, the careful cadence of speeches, the polite applause as each demand was read aloud. It was not yet the roar of a mass movement. It was more like the quiet hum of a gathering storm. But storms begin this way, with a shift in the air, with whispers that slowly grow into voices, with voices that someday become unshakable calls for freedom. The rise of the Indian National Congress marked the beginning of that journey. It was the first step. In the calm of those early years, a fire was quietly kindling, one that would, in time, light the path to independence. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Indian National Congress had already been meeting for nearly 2 decades. Year after year, resolutions were passed, petitions were sent, and eloquent speeches were made. But for many Indians, change still felt distant. Poverty remained crushing. Famines struck again and again, and the government's indifference was painfully clear. The time of polite appeals was slowly giving way to a more assertive spirit. The Congress, once dominated by the moderates, was entering a new phase. This phase would be shaped by fiery leaders, by bold ideas, and by the rising call for Swaraj, self-rule. In the last decade of the 19th century, a new generation of leaders began to emerge. They were impatient with the slow, cautious methods of the moderates. To them, petitions seemed weak, resolutions too timid. They wanted action, they wanted urgency, and above all, they wanted independence. The most famous among them were Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Lala Lajpat Rai, often remembered together as Lal Bal and Pal. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, from Maharashtra, was perhaps the fiercest. A brilliant teacher and journalist, Tilak used newspapers and festivals to spread his message. Through his papers, Kesari in Maratha and Maratha in English, he criticized the British in bold, unflinching terms. He understood the power of culture in uniting people. By organizing public celebrations of Ganesh Chaturthi and Shivaji Jayanti, he turned traditional festivals into gatherings of political awareness. His most famous words, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it," became a rallying cry for generations. Bipin Chandra Pal from Bengal was a passionate orator. He combined fiery speeches with a vision of economic self-reliance, urging Indians to embrace Swadeshi, the use of homegrown goods, and the rejection of foreign imports. Lala Lajpat Rai, from Punjab, inspired people with his energy and writings. He became deeply involved in social reforms, while also pressing for political rights. His work in education, particularly through the establishment of institutions, left a lasting mark. Together, these men infused the Congress with a spirit of defiance. They were called extremists, not because they promoted violence at this stage, but because their demands and methods were considered bold, even radical, compared to the cautious ways of the moderates. The turning point came in 1905 with the partition of Bengal. Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, announced that Bengal, then the largest province, would be divided into two parts. The official reason given was administrative convenience, but many Indians believed the true motive was to weaken nationalist unity. Bengal was the heart of political activity at the time, and dividing it along religious lines, with East Bengal having a Muslim majority and West Bengal a Hindu majority, seemed like a deliberate attempt to sow division. The response was electric. The announcement sparked protests across Bengal and beyond. Students, workers, and ordinary citizens joined in demonstrations. And from this anger, the Swadeshi movement was born. Swadeshi, meaning of one's own country, was both an economic and a political idea. Indians were urged to boycott British goods, from textiles to salt, and to instead use Indian-made products. Foreign cloth was burned in bonfires, while spinning wheels once again turned to produce khadi. Shops refused to stock imported goods, and people proudly wore local fabrics. The movement was not just about economics. It was about self-respect, about declaring that India could stand on its own feet. It was also about unity. Songs, plays, and patriotic literature spread the message. Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet, tied Rakhi threads on people's wrists, symbolizing brotherhood beyond religious divisions. The Swadeshi movement was one of the first mass movements of modern India. It showed that nationalism was no longer just the concern of the educated elite. It was becoming a cause that ordinary people embraced. The rise of Swadeshi also deepened the divide within the Congress. The moderates, led by figures like Gopal Krishna Gokhale, felt that boycotts and protests were too confrontational. They feared alienating the British and preferred gradual reform. The extremists, on the other hand, insisted that without pressure and self-reliance, India would never achieve freedom. At the Congress session in Surat in 1907, these tensions boiled over. The meeting descended into chaos, and the Congress formally split into two factions, moderates and extremists. Though divided, both groups contributed to the freedom struggle in their own ways. The moderates kept up steady pressure through constitutional reforms, while the extremists stirred popular energy and pride. This dual approach, reform and resistance, would continue to shape Indian politics in the years to come. Alongside the extremists, there were also groups of young revolutionaries who believed that only direct action, even armed struggle, could shake the empire. Inspired by the revolutions in Europe and angered by British repression, they began forming secret societies. In Bengal, organizations like Enishalan Samiti carried out bombings and assassinations, targeting colonial officials. Young men, often in their teens and 20s, went underground, printing pamphlets and training in secrecy. While these revolutionary activities were limited in scale, they reflected the growing frustration of a younger generation. They also showed that Indian nationalism was no longer a polite discussion in drawing rooms. It had begun to take many forms, from peaceful petitions to radical underground networks. The early 20th century was also a time when nationalism began to spread beyond politics. It entered schools, literature, art, and religion. Writers and poets used their words to kindle patriotism. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Vande Mataram became an anthem of the movement. Painters like Abanindranath Tagore sought to revive Indian styles of art, blending tradition with modernity. Education, too, became a site of resistance. National schools and colleges were established, offering alternatives to British institutions. Students boycotted government schools and joined these new centers, where patriotism was woven into the curriculum. Religion, though sometimes divisive, was also used as a source of inspiration. Tilak's invocation of Shivaji and the Ganesh festival was one example. Across India, historical heroes and spiritual figures were reimagined as symbols of resistance. All of this created an atmosphere in which nationalism was not confined to speeches and resolutions. It began to seep into daily life, into what people wore, what they sang, what they bought, and how they prayed. If you picture India in those years, you might see young students walking through dusty streets, chanting Vande Mataramas as they march with flags. You might imagine shopkeepers quietly refusing to sell foreign cloth, while mothers spin thread at home. You might see lawyers and teachers debating in Congress halls, while in hidden corners, revolutionaries whisper plans for daring acts. It was an age of ferment, of energy, of awakening. The extremists and the Swadeshi movement gave nationalism a new urgency, a new passion. The fire that had begun as a polite flicker in the halls of Congress was now spreading into homes, markets, and fields. The struggle was still young. Independence was still decades away. But the age of extremists had shown something vital, that the Indian people were no longer willing to wait silently. They had begun to claim their destiny. By 1914, the winds of change were already moving through India. Nationalism had gained momentum with the Swadeshi movement, and the Congress was slowly recovering from the split between moderates and extremists. Then, in the summer of that year, an event far away in Europe transformed everything. The outbreak of the First World War. The war would last from 1914 to 1918, drawing in countries and colonies from across the globe. For India still under the British crown, it became a moment of both sacrifice and opportunity, a time when thousands gave their lives on distant battlefields, and when hopes for political concessions grew only to be met with disappointment. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, India, as part of the empire, was automatically involved. The scale of India's contribution was enormous. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers served during the war. Nearly 74,000 lost their lives. Another 65,000 were wounded. Indian troops were sent not only to the battlefields of Europe, but also to Africa and the Middle East. In France, they faced the bitter cold of the trenches, fighting in unfamiliar conditions against German forces. In Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, Indian divisions made up a large portion of the British Army, enduring long marches, heat, and disease. The bravery of Indian soldiers was widely acknowledged. Stories of their courage reached home through letters and reports. Sikh regiments, Gurkha battalions, Rajputs, and countless others fought with distinction. The sacrifice was real and heavy. But India's contribution went beyond manpower. Financially, the subcontinent bore a huge burden. Taxes were raised, war loans were collected, and Indian industries were pushed to supply materials for the war. Food, grains, cotton, and raw materials were diverted, causing shortages at home. For many Indian leaders, especially the moderates, the war seemed like an opportunity. They believed that by supporting Britain in its hour of need, India could earn political concessions in return. The hope was that loyalty would be rewarded with self-government, not full independence yet, but at least greater autonomy within the empire. Leaders like Gopal Krishna Gokhale had long advocated gradual reforms, and the war seemed to present the perfect moment for Britain to acknowledge India's readiness. Even some extremists, such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who had returned to politics after imprisonment, softened their tone temporarily, believing that cooperation might bring progress. The Indian National Congress, in its resolutions, expressed support for the war. Recruiting drives were conducted, speeches were made urging young men to join the army, and money was collected for the war fund. The sense was clear. India was making a massive sacrifice. Surely, when the war ended, Britain would recognize this loyalty and grant meaningful reforms. Yet, beneath the surface, discontent simmered. The war placed enormous strain on ordinary Indians. Prices of basic goods, rice, wheat, cloth, soared. Inflation made daily life harder for the poor. Taxes were increased to fund the war, and new war loans added further burdens. In rural areas, recruitment campaigns sometimes became coercive. Peasants were pressured to send their sons to the army, even if families depended on them for farming. While some saw military service as a path to steady wages, others viewed it as forced sacrifice for a distant empire. At the same time, shortages of food and fuel hit urban centers. Strikes by workers in textile mills and railway workshops reflected growing economic frustration. Farmers, too, faced hardships as crops were requisitioned or as prices failed to keep pace with costs. For the wealthier classes, opportunities did appear. Indian industrialists, like the Tata family, expanded their businesses by supplying steel, textiles, and other goods. But for the majority, the war years meant heavier burdens, not relief. The war also gave new energy to revolutionary groups, both inside India and among Indians abroad. In North America and Canada, the Ghadar Party, formed by Punjabi immigrants, called for revolt against British rule. They believed the war presented the perfect chance, with Britain distracted by European battles. The Ghadar leaders planned to spark uprisings in India, sending men and arms back home. In Berlin, a group of Indian nationalists worked with German support to encourage rebellion. This came to be known as the Berlin Committee, or the Indian Independence Committee. They hoped that a German victory would weaken Britain and open the door for Indian independence. Inside India, secret societies also became active again. Though many of these efforts were crushed by British intelligence, they reflected a rising spirit, the idea that Indians could no longer wait passively for reforms. One of the most significant political developments during the war years was the Lucknow Pact of 1916. For decades, the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League had been drifting apart. The Congress was seen as dominated by Hindu leaders, while the League, founded in 1906, focused on safeguarding Muslim interests. Cooperation between the two had been rare. But in Lucknow in 1916, a remarkable agreement was reached. The Congress, under leaders like Tilak and Annie Besant, and the League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, came together on a common platform. The pact stated that both Hindus and Muslims would work jointly for greater self-government. It also recognized separate electorates for Muslims, ensuring representation of their interests. The Lucknow Pact was important not just for its practical terms, but for the spirit it represented: Hindu and Muslim unity against colonial rule. For a brief period, the nationalist movement gained strength from this partnership. Around the same time, another development gave fresh energy to the freedom struggle: the Home Rule movement. Inspired by the Irish struggle for home rule, two leaders, Bal Gangadhar Tilak in Maharashtra and Annie Besant, an Englishwoman turned Indian nationalist, launched leagues to demand self-government for India. The Home Rule leagues spread rapidly, with branches in towns and cities across the country. They organized meetings, published pamphlets, and encouraged debate. For many, the idea of home rule, not complete independence, but self-government within the empire, seemed both achievable and inspiring. Annie Besant, with her passionate speeches and writings, became a beloved figure. Tilak, with his organizational skills and influence, drew thousands into the cause. Together, they revived political activity, especially at a time when many were disillusioned by the slow progress of Congress. When the war finally ended in November 1918, the world was transformed. Old empires had fallen, new nations were being born, and the principle of self-determination was being spoken of by leaders like U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. For Indians, hope was high. Having given so much lives, money, resources, there was an expectation that Britain would now honor its promises. In August 1917, even before the war ended, the British Secretary of State, Edwin Montagu, had declared that the goal of British policy was the gradual development of self-governing institutions in India. This seemed encouraging at the time, but the details that followed, in the form of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919, would fall far short of expectations. The disappointment was bitter. Instead of genuine power, the reforms offered only limited provincial councils, with real authority still firmly in British hands. To make matters worse, alongside the reforms came the Relat Acts, which allowed indefinite detention without trial. Thus, the very war that had raised hopes ended with frustration and anger. India had fought for the empire, but the empire was not willing to trust India with freedom. If you imagine India during the war years, you might see soldiers in turbans marching across the muddy fields of France, writing letters home in simple Hindi or Punjabi, longing for the warmth of their villages. You might picture mothers in rural homes spinning thread while rationing food so their sons in the army could be supplied. You might hear the voices of Annie Besant and Tilak echoing in crowded halls, calling for home rule. It was a time of sacrifice, but also a time of awakening. The First World War showed India both its strength and its vulnerability. It proved that Indians could fight with bravery, contribute with loyalty, and organize with vision. But it also proved that the colonial rulers would not easily give up power, no matter the promises made. The stage was now set for a new leader to rise, someone who would channel India's discontent into a mass movement unlike any before. And so, as we move forward, we will meet Mahatma Gandhi, the man who would transform the struggle for freedom with the power of nonviolence. The year 1857 marked a profound turning point in the history of India. The uprising had shaken the British Empire to its core. Though suppressed, the rebellion forced Britain to reconsider its relationship with the subcontinent. What emerged after was not just a continuation of colonial dominance, but a restructured, even more centralized system of control, accompanied by sweeping reforms intended to prevent such upheaval from ever rising again. When the dust of rebellion settled, the East India Company, once the all-powerful trading corporation turned ruler, was stripped of its governing powers. In 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control. The proclamation of Queen Victoria promised justice, equality before the law, and respect for India's ancient traditions and religions. To many Indians, weary of war, this sounded like a hopeful shift. But in reality, the new system often masked old inequalities and introduced fresh hardships. Under the Crown, India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, but that glitter came at a cost borne by ordinary Indians. Administration grew more rigid. The civil service became a powerful instrument of control, with most top positions reserved for the British. Indian participation in governance was limited, often symbolic, and rarely influential. This deliberate exclusion planted early seeds of discontent, especially among educated Indians who began to ask why they were deemed unfit to govern their own land. The British also reorganized the army after 1857. Indian soldiers were still recruited, but regiments were carefully structured to prevent unity. Groups were divided by religion, caste, and region, a strategy meant to ensure loyalty and avoid another rebellion. While effective in the short term, this practice deepened divisions within Indian society. Economically, the Crown's policies brought both development and devastation. On the one hand, railways, telegraphs, and canals expanded rapidly. These were introduced to serve the needs of empire, to move troops, transport raw materials, and connect ports, but they inadvertently connected Indians to each other in new ways. A villager traveling by train could suddenly meet someone from hundreds of miles away, sharing stories, grievances, and ideas. This would later prove crucial in uniting a diverse population under one national identity. On the other hand, British economic priorities drained India's wealth. Vast tracts of land were reorganized to grow cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium, often at the expense of food cultivation. Famines became more frequent and deadly. In the late 19th century, millions perished in famines that were exacerbated by rigid colonial policies. The suffering was not lost on the people. They could see their hardship contrasted with the riches flowing to Britain. Amid this backdrop, a new class of Indians was emerging. English education, introduced in the early 19th century, had produced a generation of lawyers, teachers, journalists, and civil servants. These educated Indians could read British political thought, understand the principles of liberty and democracy, and recognize the gap between Britain's ideals and its actions in India. They began to ask difficult questions. If Britain celebrated freedom at home, why was India denied the same? It was in this environment that the first stirrings of organized political activity took shape. The later 19th century saw the rise of social reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy earlier in Bengal, and after 1857, figures such as Swami Dayananda Saraswati with the Arya Samaj, and reformist movements like the Brahmo Samaj. These groups sought not only spiritual and social renewal, but also began to awaken a sense of pride in India's heritage, while calling for progress and modernization. Journalism, too, became a quiet but powerful weapon. Newspapers in English and Indian languages began to circulate ideas, spread awareness of colonial injustices, and encouraged debate. They gave voice to grievances that otherwise would have been ignored. Whether it was about unfair land taxes, famine mismanagement, or racial discrimination, these publications built a shared consciousness among readers across regions. By the 1870s and 1880s, a spirit of political association was slowly taking shape. Groups like the Indian Association in Bengal and similar regional societies brought together educated Indians to discuss reforms. These organizations were cautious, often loyal in tone, but they were planting the roots of something larger. Their leaders believed in gradual progress, in working within the system, but even this limited activism was significant. It marked the beginning of Indians stepping into public life, speaking as a collective, and asserting that they had a voice. The moment of crystallization came in 1885, when the Indian National Congress was founded. At first, the Congress was not a mass movement, but a platform for debate. It brought together men from different provinces, different languages, and different communities, a remarkable feat in itself. Their initial demands were modest: greater Indian representation in government, fairness in the civil service, and reforms in taxation. Yet even these modest beginnings carried a revolutionary undertone. For the first time, Indians were organizing politically on a national scale. In its early years, the Congress was often dismissed by the British as a talking shop, a gathering of elites with little real power. But beneath the surface, it was laying the foundation of nationalism. Year after year, through speeches and resolutions, it nurtured a generation of leaders, encouraged debate, and built the habit of seeing India not as fragmented provinces, but as one entity. This period also saw important shifts in identity. Where earlier loyalties had often been local or religious, the Congress encouraged thinking of India as a nation. Poets, reformers, and thinkers contributed to this awakening. The rediscovery of India's ancient history, its literature, and its philosophies gave Indians a sense of pride that countered colonial portrayals of them as backward or incapable. At the same time, challenges remained. Poverty was widespread, illiteracy high, and divisions of caste, class, and religion made unity difficult. The Congress, in its early years, was criticized for being too focused on the educated middle class, too cautious in its approach. And yet, this was an essential stage in the journey. Movements rarely leap fully formed into being. They grow slowly, nurtured by ideas and experiences, and shaped by trial and error. Thus, the years after 1857 were paradoxical. They were years of tighter colonial control, harsher economic policies, and frequent suffering. But they were also the years in which Indians began to imagine freedom, to speak of rights, and to gather under common platforms. The rebellion had failed militarily, but its legacy lived on. It had cracked the illusion of invincibility that surrounded British rule, and in its aftermath, it inspired a generation to search for a different future. In these decades of apparent quiet, the ground was being prepared. The railways carried not just goods, but ideas. The printing press spread not just news, but awareness. And organizations, however small, kept alive the possibility that Indians could one day govern themselves. The seeds had been planted, and though they would take decades to bloom, they were growing silently, steadily, beneath the surface of empire. When the Indian National Congress was founded in 1885, it was little more than an experiment. A small group of men, mostly professionals and lawyers, gathering to petition for reforms. Few could have predicted that this organization would one day spearhead the struggle for independence. Yet, like a sapling taking root, the Congress grew steadily, drawing nourishment from the frustrations, hopes, and ideas of an entire generation. In its early decades, the Congress was dominated by leaders who came to be known as moderates. Figures like Dadabhai Naoroji, W.C. Banerjee, Pherozeshah Mehta, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale believed in patient constitutional methods. They argued that Britain's liberal traditions, its parliament, its press, its system of law could be used to achieve justice for India. To them, petitions, resolutions, and appeals were the tools of progress. These moderates were not naive. They understood the depth of India's problems: economic drain, lack of representation, and widespread poverty. Dadabhai Naoroji, in fact, gave one of the most powerful critiques of colonial rule in his drain theory. He argued, with data and precision, that wealth was being siphoned from India to Britain, leaving Indians impoverished while enriching the empire. This analysis struck a chord among educated Indians, providing a scientific explanation for what ordinary people had long felt. Still, the moderates stopped short of demanding independence. Their vision was of reform within empire, greater Indian participation in government, fairness in taxation, improvement in education, and economic justice. They were loyal critics rather than rebels, and for a time their strategy seemed practical. Many believed Britain, with its claims of democracy and justice, would eventually grant India greater rights. But not all Indians agreed with this cautious approach. As the Congress grew, so did impatience. By the turn of the 20th century, a new generation of leaders, fiery, outspoken, and uncompromising, began to rise. Tilak, in particular, electrified the movement. He spoke of self-rule, not as a distant ideal, but as a fundamental right. Festivals that had once been religious became platforms for political awareness, drawing thousands into the nationalist fold. The extremists criticized the moderates for being too timid, too dependent on British goodwill. They argued that petitions and polite appeals had achieved little. Instead, they called for boycotts of British goods, promotion of Swadeshi indigenous products, and a spirit of self-reliance. Their methods were confrontational, but also empowering. For the first time, ordinary Indians were asked to take part in the movement, not just as observers, but as active participants. This difference in strategy soon led to open conflict within the Congress. The annual session of 1907 in Surat became infamous for the split between moderates and extremists. What began as heated debate turned into outright confrontation. The moderates wanted gradual reform. The extremists wanted Swaraj and were willing to use agitation to achieve it. Unable to reconcile, the Congress divided. The split weakened the movement in the short term, but it also reflected a deeper truth. Indian nationalism was diversifying, no longer confined to petitions and meetings. It was now spreading into the streets, markets, and homes. The Swadeshi movement that followed the partition of Bengal in 1905 showed this vividly. Lord Curzon, the British Viceroy, had announced the partition of Bengal, citing administrative convenience, but Indians saw it differently, as a deliberate attempt to divide and rule by separating Hindus and Muslims in Bengal. The reaction was explosive. Students boycotted schools, lawyers boycotted courts, and households gave up British cloth and salt. Instead, people spun their own khadi, supported local industries, and took pride in resisting foreign goods. This was a turning point. The movement was no longer just about elite petitions. It had entered the daily lives of people. Women joined boycotts, students marched in protests, and the streets buzzed with nationalist slogans. The idea of Swaraj, though still undefined, was beginning to capture hearts across India. Yet the British were not idle observers. They responded with repression. Leaders were arrested, newspapers censored, and protests suppressed. Tilak himself was imprisoned more than once, his writings deemed seditious, but repression often backfired. Each arrest turned leaders into heroes. Each act of censorship fueled anger. The empire was learning that ruling India was no longer as simple as issuing decrees from above. Meanwhile, the moderates continued their work, often from within the system. Leaders like Gopal Krishna Gokhale believed that constitutional reforms were still possible and worth pursuing. Gokhale, respected even by the British, pushed for educational reforms and social progress. His vision was of a gradual awakening, guided by reason and persuasion rather than confrontation. In truth, both moderates and extremists contributed to the nationalist cause. The moderates kept alive the language of rights and justice, showing that Indians could engage in reasoned debate and political dialogue. The extremists, on the other hand, infused the movement with energy, urgency, and mass participation. Together, they represented the two strands of India's awakening, one cautious, the other bold. By the early 20th century, nationalism was no longer confined to a small circle of elites. It had spread through newspapers, festivals, boycotts, and debates. The sense of being Indian, of belonging to something larger than caste, religion, or region, was growing stronger. The Congress was still fractured, but the idea of self-rule had entered the public imagination. In these decades, we can see the independence movement gathering momentum. What had begun as petitions had grown into boycotts. What had started as polite appeals had turned into mass protests. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges and setbacks, but the direction was clear. Indians were no longer content with being subjects. They were beginning to dream of being citizens, free, equal, and sovereign. By the early years of the 20th century, India's freedom movement was at a crossroads. The Indian National Congress had split between moderates and extremists. The Swadeshi movement had shown the power of mass mobilization, and British repression had grown harsher. Yet, alongside the Congress, another stream of nationalism was taking root, one that was more radical, often secretive, and willing to embrace violence. These were the revolutionary movements, scattered across India, but united by a fierce determination to strike directly at colonial rule. In Bengal, secret societies like Enishelan Samiti and Jugantar began training young men in the use of arms, inspired by tales of past heroes and fueled by frustration with British oppression. These revolutionaries believed that petitions and protests would never bring freedom. Only direct action, assassinations, bombings, and armed struggle could shake the empire. One of the most famous early incidents was the Alipore bomb case, 1908. A group of revolutionaries had plotted to assassinate a British official, but their plan went awry, leading to arrests and trials that drew national attention. Among those implicated was Aurobindo Ghosh, who would later turn to spirituality, but in those days was a fiery nationalist writer and organizer. The trial became a symbol of youthful defiance against colonial authority. Other parts of India also saw revolutionary activity. In Maharashtra, Men like Vasudeva Balwant Phadke had earlier dreamed of armed struggle. In Punjab, groups with connections abroad began organizing to strike at the British. Many revolutionaries looked for inspiration overseas, in the Irish struggle, in the Russian revolutionaries, and in the writings of European anarchists. One striking feature of this period was the role of the Indian diaspora. Across the world, in London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo, Indians formed circles dedicated to liberation. Figures like Shyamji Krishnavarma, who set up India House in London, and Madame Bikaji Kama, who unfurled an early version of the Indian flag at an international socialist conference in Stuttgart in 1907, became symbols of global resistance. World War I had raised expectations. British leaders promised that loyal support from India would be rewarded with political concessions after victory. In 1917, Britain's Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, announced that the goal of British policy was the gradual development of self-governing institutions. It was a vague promise, but to many Indians it suggested that reforms were on the horizon. The war years also saw the rise of new leaders who would soon redefine the struggle. Among them was a man who had spent much of his adult life abroad, working in South Africa, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi returned to India in 1915 after 2 decades in South Africa, where he had pioneered his philosophy of satyagraha, non-violent resistance. In South Africa, he had fought against discriminatory laws targeting Indians, organizing campaigns that combined moral courage with mass discipline. By the time he returned home, he was already known as a leader of rare conviction. At first, Gandhi did not plunge directly into national politics. Instead, he spent time traveling across India, observing conditions, listening to people, and understanding the land he had been away from for so long. He was struck by the poverty of the villages where the majority of Indians lived, and by the resilience of ordinary people. His first major involvement came in Champaran, 1917, in Bihar, where indigo farmers were being exploited by European planters. Gandhi led a satyagraha that forced the planters to make concessions, marking his first victory in India. Soon after, in Ahmedabad, 1918, he supported textile workers, demanding better wages. In Kedah, 1918, he stood by peasants who could not pay taxes due to crop failure. Each of these struggles was local, but together they signaled a new kind of politics, one rooted in mass participation, non-violence, and moral authority. Gandhi's approach was different from both the moderates and extremists of the earlier Congress. Unlike the moderates, he did not rely solely on petitions to the British. Unlike the extremists, he rejected violence. Instead, he sought to awaken the moral conscience of both rulers and ruled. His method was simple, yet radical: to resist injustice without hatred, to disobey unjust laws without violence, and to appeal to truth as the ultimate power. By the end of World War I, India stood at the threshold of change. The moderates had won some reforms in the Indian Councils Act of 1909 and later in the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919, but these were limited and unsatisfactory. The extremists had inspired courage but faced repression. The revolutionaries had stirred hearts but achieved little lasting organization. Into this landscape stepped Gandhi, whose ideas would soon give the movement a new center. His genius lay in bringing together the strengths of all streams: the moderates' reasoned appeals, the extremists' mass mobilization, the revolutionaries' passion while channeling them through the discipline of nonviolence. He also broadened the movement beyond the educated elite. Farmers, workers, women, and the poor found a place in Gandhi's campaigns. Politics was no longer the preserve of lawyers and professionals. It was becoming the work of the nation. The stage was set for a dramatic new chapter. In the years immediately following the war, disillusionment with British rule would grow, fueled by broken promises and brutal repression. Gandhi's leadership would soon be tested in one of the most turbulent phases of India's freedom struggle, a period that would see both tragedy and unprecedented unity. When World War I ended in 1918, much of India expected that loyalty and sacrifice would be rewarded. India had also sent grain, cotton, money, and labor to fuel Britain's war effort. Ordinary people bore the brunt of shortages, rising prices, and heavier taxes. Now, with the war over, many Indians hoped that Britain would honor its promises and grant genuine self-government. But the post-war years brought not relief, but disillusionment and anger. In 1919, the British government passed a law that came to be known as the Rowlatt Act. It extended wartime emergency powers into peacetime, allowing the government to arrest people without trial, censor the press, and detain suspects indefinitely. In short, it gave the colonial state almost unlimited authority to crush dissent. Indians across the political spectrum were outraged. The moderate leaders of the Congress, usually willing to compromise, now stood alongside radicals in condemning the act. For Gandhi, who had just begun to lead national campaigns, the Rowlatt Act was a moral test. He called it a black law and launched a nationwide movement of satyagraha against it. For the first time, Gandhi asked the entire country, Hindus and Muslims, rich and poor, men and women, to participate in a campaign of peaceful resistance. Strikes, general shutdowns, and protests swept across India. Shops closed, crowds filled the streets, and ordinary people defied British authority. The movement spread rapidly, but it also revealed the difficulty of keeping mass protest nonviolent. In several places, demonstrations turned into riots. Police stations were attacked, and officials were assaulted. Gandhi, deeply distressed by the outbreaks of violence, even suspended the campaign. But the point had been made. The old order was cracking, and the people of India were no longer passive subjects. It was against this backdrop that one of the darkest tragedies in modern Indian history unfolded. In Punjab, tensions were especially high. The province had contributed heavily to the war effort, but farmers faced crushing debt and soldiers returned to hardship. When the Rowlatt Act protests broke out, the colonial administration responded with repression. Two nationalist leaders, Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satyapal, were arrested in Amritsar. On April 13, 1919, the festival of Baisakhi, thousands of villagers gathered at Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden in Amritsar, to protest peacefully. Families, farmers, and ordinary townspeople filled the grounds. Without warning, British Brigadier General Reginald Dyer marched in with his troops. Seeing the unarmed crowd, he gave the order to fire. For about 10 minutes, the soldiers fired into the mass of people, aiming directly at the densest sections of the crowd. The narrow exits were blocked. Panic-stricken men, women, and children had nowhere to run. Some leapt into a well to escape the bullets. By the time the firing stopped, hundreds lay dead and over 1,000 were wounded. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre shocked the nation. The official British count admitted around 379 deaths, but Indian estimates put the number much higher. Word spread quickly across India, igniting outrage and grief. Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, returned his knighthood in protest. Gandhi declared that cooperation with such a government was morally impossible. General Dyer, instead of facing immediate punishment, was hailed as a hero by many in Britain's conservative circles. This deepened Indian anger. Too many, Jallianwala Bagh symbolized the true face of colonial rule. Unfeeling, brutal, and ready to massacre its subjects to preserve power. Meanwhile, the British attempted to placate Indian opinion with the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919. These reforms expanded provincial legislatures and introduced a system called diarchy, where elected Indians could control certain departments like education and health, while key areas like finance, law, and order remained firmly in British hands. But these changes fell far short of expectations. Indians saw them as half measures designed to maintain colonial control while pretending to share power. The contrast between promises of reform and the reality of repression only fueled resentment. Around the same time, another powerful current entered Indian politics, the Khilafat movement. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire, long seen by many Muslims as a symbol of Islamic unity, faced dismemberment by the victorious Allies. In India, Muslim leaders launched the Khilafat movement to defend the authority of the Ottoman Caliph. For them, it was both a religious and political cause. Gandhi saw an opportunity. By supporting the Khilafat cause, he hoped to unite Hindus and Muslims in a common struggle against British rule. He urged Congress to join hands with Muslim leaders like the Ali brothers, Shaukat Ali, and Muhammad Ali for a time. The Khilafat and nationalist movements marched together, creating a powerful sense of unity across religious lines. The outrage over Jallianwala Bagh, the disappointment with reforms, and the energy of the Khilafat campaign all came together in Gandhi's first great nationwide movement, non-cooperation. Launched in 1920, the non-cooperation movement called on Indians to withdraw their cooperation from British institutions. Gandhi urged people to boycott government schools, law courts, and councils. He called for the rejection of British honors, titles, and goods. Instead, Indians were encouraged to spin their own cloth khadi, support indigenous industries, and build self-reliant communities. For the first time, millions of Indians, farmers, workers, students, merchants, and women participated in a political movement. The boycott spread across cities and villages alike. Lawyers like C. Rajagopalari and Motilal Nehru gave up their practices. Students left government colleges to join new national schools. People burned British cloth in bonfires and proudly wore homespun khadi. The movement was marked by remarkable discipline in many places, but also by outbreaks of violence in others. Gandhi constantly emphasized non-violence as the foundation of the struggle. For him, self-rule was not merely about political power, it was about moral transformation. In February 1922, however, tragedy struck. In Uttar Pradesh, a protest turned violent. Police opened fire on demonstrators, who retaliated by attacking a police station. In the chaos, over 20 policemen were killed. For Gandhi, this was unacceptable. To him, violence corrupted the soul of the movement. Against the wishes of many Congress leaders, he called off the non-cooperation movement. The decision stunned the nation. Some felt betrayed. Others admired his moral consistency. Though the movement ended abruptly, its impact was enormous. It had awakened millions to the possibility of resistance, shattered the myth of British invincibility, and made Gandhi the undisputed leader of Indian nationalism. By the early 1920s, India had entered a new phase of its freedom struggle. The moderates of the Congress were no longer in charge. Gandhi's vision of mass, non-violent struggle had become the central strategy. The British, meanwhile, realized that they were facing not just educated elites, but a mobilized nation. The years ahead would bring setbacks and divisions, but also new forms of resistance. For now, the memory of Jallianwala Bagh, the spirit of Khilafat, and the power of non-cooperation had transformed India's fight for independence into a truly mass movement. The sudden suspension of the non-cooperation movement in 1922, after the Chauri Chaura incident, left the nation in shock. For many, it felt like a giant wave had receded just when it was beginning to gather unstoppable force. But in reality, the 1920s became a decade of reorganization, new leadership, and deeper debates about how India's struggle should move forward. Soon after calling off the movement, Gandhi was arrested in March 1922, charged with sedition. He stood before a British judge and calmly accepted responsibility for his actions. In a courtroom packed with onlookers, Gandhi delivered a statement that has since become famous. He declared that non-cooperation with evil was a duty, not a crime. The judge, visibly moved, still sentenced Gandhi to 6 years in prison. But Gandhi's imprisonment only enhanced his moral stature. To millions, he was not just a political leader, but the embodiment of truth and sacrifice. While Gandhi remained behind bars, the Congress faced the challenge of how to sustain the momentum of the national movement without its central figure. In Gandhi's absence, a new generation of leaders rose to prominence. Among them were C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru, father of Jawaharlal Nehru. They believed that while boycotting British legislatures had been powerful, it was time to enter the councils and fight from within. This approach became known as the Swarajist strategy, the Swaraj Party, as it came to be called. Contested elections under the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms and entered the provincial legislatures. Their aim was not to cooperate, but to obstruct colonial rule from the inside. They debated budgets, blocked laws, and used the assemblies as platforms to demand full self-rule. Meanwhile, other congressmen, loyal to Gandhi's original vision, preferred to continue working outside colonial institutions. They focused on constructive programs, promoting khadi, village industries, and education. This split between the Swarajists and the so-called no-changers reflected the larger debate within Indian nationalism. Should the struggle be waged through confrontation or through moral transformation? Despite differences, both approaches contributed to keeping the spirit of nationalism alive during Gandhi's imprisonment. It was during the 1920s that two figures who would later dominate India's political future began to step into the spotlight: Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose. Nehru, educated at Harrow, Cambridge, and trained as a barrister in London, returned to India with a sharp mind and deep curiosity about global ideas. Under the influence of his father Motilal and his growing closeness to Gandhi, Nehru became passionately committed to India's independence. But unlike Gandhi, Nehru was increasingly drawn to socialist ideas, believing that political freedom would mean little without social and economic transformation. Bose, meanwhile, came from Bengal, a region long at the forefront of nationalism. Brilliant and uncompromising, he too had studied in England, but chose to devote his life to the struggle for freedom. He admired Gandhi, but found his emphasis on non-violence too limiting. Bose believed India's liberation would require more radical, even revolutionary methods. In the 1920s, both Nehru and Bose were still young leaders, finding their voice, but they represented the future, a generation less patient, less willing to compromise, and eager to see India take its place among the world's free nations. One of the most striking features of the early 1920s had been the temporary Hindu-Muslim unity forged during the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements. But by the mid-1920s, cracks began to appear. The collapse of the Khilafat movement, after the abolition of the Caliphate in Turkey, left many Muslims disillusioned. Communal riots broke out in several parts of India. The rise of organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League, each appealing to religious identity, complicated the dream of a united struggle. Congress leaders worked hard to maintain harmony, but the seeds of division were being sown. These tensions would haunt the freedom struggle in the decades to come. In 1924, after serving just 2 years of his sentence, Gandhi was released from prison due to ill health. By then, the Swearigists and No-Changers had already been debating strategy for some time. Gandhi tried to bridge their differences, urging both sides to see their efforts as complementary. He also shifted focus to what he called the constructive program, promoting khadi, village sanitation, Hindu-Muslim unity, and the removal of untouchability. Gandhi believed that political independence had to be rooted in a moral and social awakening. Still, many young nationalists grew restless. To them, Gandhi's focus on spinning wheels and village uplift seemed inadequate for the scale of the task ahead. The tension between moral idealism and political pragmatism would continue to shape the movement. The next major spark came in 1927, when the British announced the formation of the Simon Commission to review constitutional reforms in India. Not a single Indian was included in the commission. It was composed entirely of British members, led by Sir John Simon. This blatant exclusion enraged Indians across the political spectrum. From moderates to radicals, Congress to the Muslim League, almost every major political group declared a boycott of the Simon Commission. When the commission arrived in India in 1928, it was met everywhere with black flag demonstrations and the slogan, "Simon, go back." In Lahore, police brutally lathi-charged protesters. One of the most respected leaders of the time, Lala Lajpat Rai, was severely beaten and later died of his injuries. His death became a rallying cry for revolutionaries. Young men like Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, and Sukhdev were deeply inspired to take up the path of armed resistance. The Simon Commission protests revealed once again the widening gulf between Britain's promises and Indian expectations. It also marked a moment when multiple strands of nationalism, constitutionalists, Gandhians, and revolutionaries, all surged forward in their own ways. In response to the Simon Commission, Indian leaders decided to draft their own constitution. A committee headed by Motilal Nehru produced the Nehru Report of 1928, which proposed dominion status for India within the British Commonwealth. But for many, especially the younger nationalists like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose, dominion status was no longer enough. They demanded nothing less than Purna Swaraj, complete independence. This generational divide became sharper as the decade closed. Gandhi was cautious, still open to negotiation with the British. The younger leaders were impatient, believing that half measures would only prolong India's subjugation. The 1920s did not achieve independence, but they were crucial in laying the groundwork for the final phase of the struggle. Gandhi had established himself as the moral leader of the nation. The Swearagists had tested the possibilities of constitutional obstruction. Young leaders like Nehru and Bose had emerged as powerful voices. Revolutionaries were beginning to challenge British rule through direct action. India was no longer just a country of petitions and resolutions. It was a land where millions had tasted the power of collective action, where a new generation was demanding freedom, and where the call for complete independence was about to take center stage. As the 1930s dawned, India stood on the edge of a decisive new chapter. The next great confrontation would come in the form of Gandhi's most dramatic campaign yet: the Salt March and the civil disobedience movement. The 1930s began with India's national movement ready for its next great confrontation. After the debates of the 1920s about Swaraj's dominion status and Purna Swaraj, the time had come for a direct challenge to British authority, and that challenge came in the form of salt. In December 1929, at the Lahore session of the Indian National Congress, Jawaharlal Nehru, chosen by Gandhi to be the youngest Congress president until then, presided over a historic gathering. At midnight on January 26, 1930, the Congress declared Purna Swaraj, complete independence, as its ultimate goal. For the first time, Indians hoisted the tricolor flag and celebrated what would later become recognized as India's Republic Day. This declaration marked a turning point. Negotiation for dominion status was no longer enough. The movement was now about full and final independence. But the question remained: how could this demand be translated into mass action? In early 1930, Gandhi announced that he would launch a civil disobedience movement. But instead of targeting something like land revenue or British courts, he chose a simple, everyday item: salt. Salt was a necessity for every household, rich or poor. Yet under British law, Indians were forbidden from making their own salt. Instead, they had to buy it from colonial monopolies and pay a heavy tax. Gandhi realized that by breaking this law, ordinary people across India could participate in resistance. It was a masterstroke of political symbolism. Salt was small, humble, and universal. By making salt, Indians would be reclaiming not just a mineral, but their dignity. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out from his Sabarmati ashram with 78 followers, including trusted lieutenants like Sarojini Naidu. They began a 24-day march to the coastal village of Dandi, covering about 240 miles. Day after day, as Gandhi walked in his simple dhoti and carried only a staff, thousands of villagers joined the procession. Along the route, Gandhi spoke to crowds, urging them to embrace non-violent resistance, boycott British goods, and spin their own cloth. By the time he reached Dandi on April 6, 1930, the world's eyes were on India. Gandhi bent down, picked up a handful of salt from the seashore, and declared that he had broken the law. This small act electrified the nation. Across India, people began making salt, selling it in markets, and openly defying British restrictions. The Salt March sparked a wave of resistance that became known as the Civil Disobedience Movement. In villages and towns, people boycotted British goods, refused to pay taxes, and resigned from government jobs. Women, inspired by Gandhi, came out in large numbers, leading protests, making salt, and picketing shops, selling foreign cloth and liquor. Peasants refused to pay land revenue. Lawyers gave up practice in colonial courts. The British responded with mass repression. Tens of thousands of people were arrested, including almost the entire Congress leadership. Gandhi himself was imprisoned, yet the movement refused to die. One of the most powerful moments came in May 1930, when a group of satyagrahis, led by Sarojini Naidu, marched to the Darasana salt works in Gujarat. British police awaited them with batons. As the satyagrahis advanced, they were beaten mercilessly, yet they did not raise a hand in return. American journalist Webb Miller, who witnessed the scene, wrote, "Not one of the marchers even raised an arm to fend off the blows. They went down like 10 pins." His report shocked the world and drew immense sympathy for India's cause. For many outside India, this was the first vivid demonstration of Gandhian nonviolence in action. The civil disobedience movement transformed India's struggle into an international story. Newspapers in Europe and America carried front-page reports of Gandhi's march and the brutal British crackdown. World leaders, writers, and ordinary citizens began to see India not just as a colony, but as a nation fighting for its rightful freedom. Gandhi himself was compared to figures like Tolstoy and Jesus, embodying the power of moral resistance against empire. For Britain, the movement was deeply embarrassing. Here was the largest colony of the empire in open rebellion, not through violence, but through peaceful defiance. By 1931, the British realized they could not crush the movement without concessions. The Viceroy, Lord Irwin, opened negotiations with Gandhi. The result was the Gandhi-Irwin Pact of March 1931. Under this agreement, the government agreed to release political prisoners. Indians were granted the right to make salt for personal use. Confiscated property of satyagrahis was returned. In return, Gandhi agreed to suspend the civil disobedience movement and attend the Second Round Table Conference in London. The pact was controversial. Many felt Gandhi had compromised too much for too little. But Gandhi believed it was a step forward and a chance to press India's case on the world stage. The British government had convened 3 round-table conferences in London to discuss India's constitutional future. The first round-table conference, 1930, took place without Congress, since its leaders were in jail. It achieved very little. The second round-table conference, 1931, saw Gandhi himself travel to London as the sole representative of the Indian National Congress. Gandhi's presence created a sensation. Dressed in his simple loincloth and shawl, he met with British officials, political leaders, and even King George V. Crowds of reporters followed his every move. Yet the conference itself was disappointing. The British insisted on discussing separate electorates for minorities, while Gandhi pressed for independence. The two sides found little common ground. The third round-table conference also went ahead without Congress and achieved nothing significant. One of the most dramatic outcomes of these negotiations was the debate over separate electorates for Dalits, then referred to as depressed classes. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, representing the interests of Dalits, demanded separate electorates to ensure political representation. Gandhi, however, opposed this, fearing it would divide Hindu society permanently. When the British announced plans to grant separate electorates under the Communal Award of 1932, Gandhi went on a fast unto death in Yerwada jail. The nation was stunned. After intense negotiations, the Pune Pact was signed between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Instead of separate electorates, the pact provided for reserved seats for Dalits within the general electorate. This compromise was historic. It kept Hindu electorates united, but it also deepened tensions between Gandhi and Ambedkar, who believed Gandhi had undermined Dalit political autonomy. Even after the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, the movement did not truly die. Throughout the early 1930s, satyagrahas continued in different regions. Peasants in Gujarat and Maharashtra refused taxes. Students boycotted schools. But repeated repression, mass arrests, and limited concessions gradually weakened the campaign. By 1934, Gandhi formally withdrew the civil disobedience movement. Yet its impact was undeniable. Millions of ordinary Indians had participated in open defiance of the Raj. Women had taken leadership roles. The world had witnessed the power of non-violent struggle. Most importantly, the demand for complete independence had now become irreversible. The 1930s were a decade of contradictions. On the one hand, India's struggle reached unprecedented heights of mass participation. On the other, divisions within Congress and between communities deepened. The Salt March and civil disobedience had shown the strength of non-violent resistance, but the limited results of the Round Table conferences also revealed the stubbornness of British rule. By the mid-1930s, attention began shifting to new constitutional reforms. The Government of India Act of 1935 and the coming role of Congress in provincial politics. But the spirit of defiance unleashed by the Salt March would continue to guide the freedom movement. The Salt March was more than a protest against a tax. It was a symbol of collective awakening. It showed that even the smallest act of defiance could shake an empire. It brought women and ordinary villagers into the heart of the struggle. It made Gandhi an international icon of non-violent resistance. As the decade ended, India stood poised for yet another phase of the fight. The next chapter would see the Congress move from the streets into the provincial legislatures. And global events, especially the outbreak of the Second World War, would push India's struggle into an even more dramatic stage. By the mid-1940s, the pressure on the British to leave India had become almost unbearable. The Second World War had drained Britain's economy, leaving it weakened and unable to maintain its vast empire. At the same time, Indian nationalists had only grown louder and more determined in their demands for freedom. What had once seemed like a distant dream was now imminent reality. But as India stood on the threshold of independence, it was clear that the path would not be smooth. The transfer of power would involve delicate negotiations, painful compromises, and decisions that would shape the destiny of millions for generations to come. When the Labour government came to power in Britain in 1945, it was far more sympathetic to Indian aspirations than its predecessors. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, in particular, was determined to end British rule in India. He understood that the empire had lost its grip and that trying to hold on to India by force was both morally and financially impossible. In 1946, he sent the Cabinet Mission to India, a group of 3 senior British officials tasked with negotiating a plan for India's future governance. The Cabinet Mission proposed a united India with a federal structure, where provinces would retain significant autonomy but share power at the center. For a brief moment, it seemed as if this might work. But the deep divisions between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League soon resurfaced. Congress leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel wanted a strong central government, while Muhammad Ali Jinnah insisted on safeguards for Muslims, fearing domination in a Hindu-majority India. The mission's plan began to unravel almost as soon as it was announced. In 1946, matters escalated further with the Direct Action Day called by the Muslim League in Calcutta. What began as a political protest turned into widespread communal violence, leaving thousands dead in the streets. The scale of the bloodshed shocked the nation. It made it painfully clear that the question of Hindu-Muslim unity had reached a breaking point. From that moment forward, the demand for a separate Muslim homeland, Pakistan, became unstoppable. Meanwhile, Britain's ability to govern India continued to collapse. The Royal Indian Navy mutiny in February 1946 was a telling sign. Sailors rose in rebellion against their British officers, demanding better treatment and openly supporting the nationalist cause. Though the uprising was quickly suppressed, it revealed how fragile British authority had become. Even the armed forces, long considered loyal, were now restless and unpredictable. Faced with these realities, the British government decided to set a firm date for departure. In early 1947, Clement Attlee announced that Britain would leave India no later than June 1948. A new viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was appointed with the specific task of overseeing the transfer of power. Mountbatten arrived in India in March 1947. Charismatic, energetic, and politically savvy, he quickly grasped the urgency of the situation. He recognized that the longer Britain delayed, the worse the violence and instability would become. Against the advice of some officials, Mountbatten advanced the timeline drastically. Instead of June 1948, he declared that Britain would leave India by August 1947, barely 5 months away. This announcement sent shockwaves through India. Political leaders suddenly had an impossibly short period to decide the future of nearly 400 million people. Partition, once considered a last resort, now seemed inevitable. Negotiations between Congress, the Muslim League, and the British intensified, but consensus was hard to reach. Mountbatten met repeatedly with Nehru, Patel, Gandhi, and Jinnah. Gandhi continued to oppose partition passionately, insisting that Hindus and Muslims could and must live together as brothers. But his voice was increasingly sidelined as the political reality hardened. Patel and Nehru, though deeply reluctant, came to accept partition as the only way to avoid an even bloodier civil war. Jinnah, for his part, remained adamant. The Muslim League would accept nothing less than a sovereign Pakistan. By June 1947, the decision was made. India would be divided into two independent nations, India and Pakistan. The Mountbatten Plan laid out the terms. Provinces like Punjab and Bengal, with large mixed populations, would be partitioned along religious lines. The princely states would be given the choice to join either India or Pakistan, though in theory they could also remain independent. The announcement of partition was met with mixed emotions. For many, it was a moment of relief. At last, independence was within sight. But for millions of ordinary people living in border regions, the news carried an undercurrent of dread. They knew that the drawing of new boundaries would tear communities apart. Neighbors who had lived side by side for centuries would suddenly find themselves on opposite sides of a hostile border. As the date of independence approached, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Communal riots flared in Punjab, Bengal, and other areas. Villages burned, families fled, and law and order broke down. The British, preparing to leave, had little capacity or will to intervene. India was already slipping into chaos before independence even arrived. On August 14, 1947, Pakistan was born. The following day, August 15th, India awoke to freedom. In Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru delivered his famous Tryst with Destiny speech, declaring that India had redeemed its pledge of independence. Crowds celebrated in the streets, waving the tricolor flag, singing and dancing. It was a moment of triumph and joy, but one overshadowed by sorrow. Because as independence dawned, partition was already unleashing one of the largest human migrations in history. Millions of Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan to cross into India, while millions of Muslims fled India to cross into Pakistan. Trains carrying refugees were attacked, caravans were ambushed. In the months that followed, perhaps 1 million people lost their lives in the violence. The dream of freedom came, but it was paid for in blood. For leaders like Gandhi, the moment was bittersweet. He refused to attend the independence celebrations, choosing instead to walk among riot-torn villages, trying to restore peace. Nehru, now India's first prime minister, and Patel, its first deputy prime minister, faced the monumental task of building a nation from the wreckage. Jinnah, as Pakistan's first governor-general, confronted similar challenges in his new state. The transfer of power in 1947 was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of nearly 200 years of British rule, but also the beginning of 2 new nations, each grappling with its own identity, hopes, and fears. For India, independence was not simply the removal of colonial rulers. It was the rebirth of a civilization that had endured centuries of subjugation and yet remained unbroken. The months following independence, in August 1947, were some of the most difficult in India's history. Freedom had been won, but the country was in turmoil. Partition had torn the land apart, and the new government faced an overwhelming challenge: how to hold together a nation scarred by violence, migration, and loss. For millions of ordinary people, survival became the immediate goal. Families who had lived in the same towns and villages for generations suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a new border. Hindus and Sikhs fled from Pakistan into India, while Muslims made the journey in the opposite direction. Entire trains, packed with refugees, crisscrossed the subcontinent, filled with people carrying only what they could hold in their hands. Camps were set up to provide shelter, but food, water, and medicine were scarce. Disease spread quickly, and hunger was common. The government, barely formed, had to deal with this enormous human crisis. Leaders like Vallabhbhai Patel worked tirelessly to organize relief, sending officials, soldiers, and volunteers to restore some measure of order. But the scale was unprecedented. It is estimated that nearly 15 million people crossed the borders during partition. No one had seen migration on such a scale before. Violence, too, did not immediately end with independence. In Punjab, villages were burned, and caravans of refugees were attacked. In Bengal, tensions flared as communities that had once lived side by side turned against each other. Gandhi, deeply saddened by this suffering, refused to celebrate independence in the grand halls of Delhi. Instead, he chose to remain in Calcutta, walking the streets, urging people to lay down their weapons. His presence brought some calm to the city, where riots paused as Hindus and Muslims responded to his call for peace. Meanwhile, India's new leaders were trying to stabilize the country politically. The princely states, more than 500 in number, had been given the choice to join either India or Pakistan. Most agreed to accede peacefully, but a few, such as Hyderabad and Kashmir, posed difficulties. Patel, through a mixture of persuasion and firmness, brought most states into the Indian Union, ensuring the country did not break apart further. Kashmir, however, remained a point of dispute and would become a source of conflict in the years to follow. Economically, India faced ruin. The partition had divided not just people, but resources. Many industries, irrigation systems, and railways were split in two. Cities like Lahore, which had been centers of trade and education, were now in Pakistan, leaving India to rebuild its own institutions. The treasury was drained, and the government had little money to invest in immediate recovery. And yet, across villages and cities, people began to pick up the pieces of their lives. Farmers returned to their fields, traders reopened shops, and schools tried to welcome children back to learning. The energy of independence, though shadowed by grief, gave many the determination to start again. In Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru spoke often of building a new India, one based on democracy, equality, and science. He envisioned an India that would overcome poverty through education and industry. Patel, meanwhile, focused on consolidating unity, making sure that India remained whole in the face of so many divisions. Together, they laid the foundation of a government that aimed not just to survive, but to grow stronger. Gandhi, however, remained restless. He could not reconcile himself to the partition and the violence it had unleashed. He traveled tirelessly, moving from village to village, urging people to forgive, to embrace compassion, and to live in harmony. His fasts against violence shook the conscience of the nation. Many who had taken up arms in anger put them down in respect for his plea. But Gandhi himself grew weary. His health declined, and his spirit carried the heavy weight of division. On January 30th, 1948, less than 6 months after independence, Gandhi was assassinated in Delhi by Nathiram Godse, a Hindu extremist who opposed his message of tolerance. His death sent shockwaves across India and the world. For millions, it felt as though the moral compass of the new nation had been lost. Nehru, in a voice heavy with grief, told the people that the light had gone out of their lives. And yet, even in this dark moment, Gandhi's teachings did not vanish. His vision of nonviolence, unity, and simplicity remained etched into the memory of the nation. The months that followed were filled with mourning, but also with renewed determination to honor his legacy by building a free, democratic India. By the spring of 1948, India had survived its first season of independence. The wounds of partition were still raw, and challenges lay ahead. But the country had endured the storm of its birth. Slowly, step by step, India was learning what it meant to be free, not just in name, but in spirit. As we reach the end of this long journey, it's worth pausing to reflect on what the story of India's independence truly means. For more than 2 centuries, India had lived under colonial rule. Generations had been born and lived their entire lives without ever knowing freedom. Yet the people never gave up the dream. They resisted in countless ways, through quiet endurance, through songs and stories, through organized protest, and through great leaders who gave voice to the longing for liberty. Independence, when it finally came in 1947, was not a gift. It was earned through sacrifice. Millions of men and women contributed in ways big and small. Some marched in protests, others went to prison. Some wrote books and speeches, while others silently tilled their fields and endured hardship, holding on to the hope that one day their children might live in a free country. Many gave their lives, whether in moments of protest met with violence, in the upheaval of partition, or in battles fought for a better tomorrow. And yet, independence was not an end point, it was a beginning. The years immediately after freedom were filled with challenges, rebuilding an economy divided by partition, creating a constitution that represented the voices of millions, and striving to keep unity in a land so vast and diverse. The leaders of that era knew that their work was only just starting. The real task was to transform independence into dignity, justice, and opportunity for every citizen. When we think back to Gandhi walking barefoot through villages, or Nehru speaking with hope about building dams and schools, or Patel working late into the night to unify the princely states, what we see is not just politics. We see a sense of duty, a recognition that freedom brought responsibility, and that the choices made in those early years would shape the destiny of generations to come. Today, the story of India's independence is remembered not only as a national triumph, but also as a human story. It is the story of ordinary people enduring extraordinary circumstances. It is the story of unity forged in diversity, of courage found in the face of fear, and of hope that carried an entire nation forward. And as we close this chapter together, let us carry with us a sense of calm reflection. History, after all, is not only about dates and battles. It is about the lives that were lived, the struggles that were endured, and the dreams that guided people through uncertainty. By remembering, we honor them. So, if you are listening to this tonight as you drift into rest, let these stories settle softly in your mind. Picture the quiet determination of those who believed in freedom when it seemed so far away. Picture the millions who set out on difficult journeys during partition, holding on to survival and hope. Picture the moment the tricolor flag was raised for the very first time, marking the dawn of a new nation. The story of India's independence is not a distant tale. It is alive in every moment of courage, resilience, and faith we see even today. And just as the country endured its first difficult season and stepped into spring, so too can we endure our own challenges, trusting that new beginnings are always possible. Now, as the night deepens, let us set these thoughts gently aside. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, allow the long arc of history to fade into the background. The struggles, the victories, the sorrows, and the joys, they can rest now as you rest. And with that, I wish you peace, comfort, and calm. Good night.